Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for appearing at committee. Mr. Commissioner, just, you mentioned about there was some delays in reporting the privacy breaches. Just trying to get a handle on the decision rights framework within CRA. Like, whose decision would it have been to not report those breaches in the timely manner?
Mr. Chair, I guess I take responsibility for what happens within the CRA. It wasn't a conscious decision in the sense of, well, let's not report them. It was, we had a massive backlog. We were sorting out the process to report these privacy breaches because we hadn't had that number in the past. We had processes to first make sure we blocked the accounts to prevent the damage, inform the people, and then try to find out what went on. And then as time went by,
the minister had no knowledge of this. So you're saying that the decision to not report was not a ministerial decision?
I'm sorry?
The decision to not report was not a ministerial decision?
Well, I guess I just take responsibility for it. It was a circumstance that we couldn't.
Here's the issue. For example,
the workload.
Since we're on this issue about decision rights, whose decision was it to reverse the decision on Bear Trust? Was it a ministerial decision to reverse that decision, or was it a department decision to reverse the requirement to file for Bear Trust?
I'm trying to remember exactly how we came to that decision. But, I have some delegated authorities in that regard, and I'm sure I discussed it with the minister for sure.
Well, here's a former boss of mine said, you can always delegate responsibility but not accountability. And it seems to me that there's a bit of murkiness around decision rights, veto rights, who makes a recommendation and who ultimately decides. Because on one hand, if it's the department deciding on, as an example, Bear Trust, so the testimony is that the CRA can decide on its own not to implement a decision by the government or the finance department. It seems to me that there's a little bit of unclarity, or it's unclear about who actually is the final authority on some of these questions. So, I think we're going to poke a little bit more on that later, I hope. But with respect to these privacy breaches, the CRA says these are result of external breaches. There was no compromise to the CRA's systems as a result of these 31,000 cases. Is that?
Certainly the vast majority of cases arise from external threats. I don't think any of the 31,000 came from ours, but I'll ask my colleagues to that. And maybe just to your previous question, I derive my powers from the minister. She can delegate them to me, so I'm sure you know how that works. But I don't know, Mark, if you want to add to that.
For these identity theft cases that we were working on, we've been working on those cases since the summer of 2020, when they actually happened. And we've been contacting the taxpayers, making sure that we were talking to the right person and doing the inquiry to figure out what happened. And we took all the actions.
So I'm just going to cut in because I have a fair bit of time. The IRS has some fairly onerous protocols in place that would prevent, payments to people that live on like Tomato Street or what have you. Why is it that we seem to have taken this position? Have we not learned anything from COVID that the pay now, audit later function really hasn't worked out that well for taxpayers?
I think that what you're raising, is actually a very good question. And I can say from talking to my colleagues internationally, including the IRS, this is an issue that all tax jurisdictions are facing, that as we've moved into a more digital world, we can do things faster. But we also have to make sure, and that's good for service, but we also have to make sure that we have proper risk containment measures in place to be able to prevent bad things from happening. But you can't go to one extreme or the other. If we stopped everything and reviewed every transaction, then things would stop. But we also can't let them go through clearly. So I would argue It's not clear to me that the IRS or anyone else has a better system
Is
of
there
trying to strike
is
that
there an
balance.
acceptable level of fraud that you think, if you pay out, I don't know, insert a number, $100 billion of payments to Canadians or $60 billion, is there a level that you say, you know what, speed is important, so if it's like 1%, it's not a big deal?
Yeah, I don't have a number
Okay.
for that, but I mean, in a sense, in concept, that what you're saying is great. You have to be able to risk manage and think about what is an acceptable level so that you strike that balance.
So
between service and
in my remaining time, I have a few follow-up questions that are reasonably detailed with respect to like the memo from before. So we'll ask for that. I'll provide those to the clerk. So I hope we can maybe follow up in writing with some specific answers on what we've spoken about today. But just finally, why in 2019 would the department be totally fine with it telling the public what's the largest single corporate tax write-off of $133 million, but today now try to hide behind the Section 241 with the largest corporate write-off?
Yeah, and maybe I will turn to my colleague, Mark Lemieux, for that. I don't have a particular memory of 2019.
Need a very quick response,
Yeah.
please.
I was not there in 2019, so I can't respond to that question, but we got that question this year, and we validated, and we can't divulge that information.
Maybe you can circle back on that, Mr. Chambers, later.
Okay.
Monsieur Lemire pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to dig deeper on something we were talking about. In its annual report, the Privacy Commissioner refers to only 113 breaches in 2023-2024, but when you look at Radio Canada's reporting, we're looking at more than 32,000. So I have two questions. What happened and how much money was involved?
So, je vais commencer. Il y a deux parties.
Your question has two parts to it. One has to do with the 2023-24 report and the number that's a lot lower. And unfortunately, we reported these cases just after the deadline for that report. But now we are aware that is one of the reasons of the difference. But Sophie might add additional elements to it. And the second part of your question, so we're looking at 31,000 cases, and the total amount of money, if I remember correctly, should be 190 million. If I remember correctly, but if not, my colleagues can correct the number. And it's cumulative from 2022 to that period. Unfortunately, it kept going up, but for the 31,000 cases, I think that's the number. Just to correct one point, there was no deadline, but we were behind. There was some delay because we were focused on protecting the accounts and protecting the citizens, and we were trying to reinforce our systems. But we are now up to date. We have caught up in terms of the numbers in the reports from the Commissioner, and we are working on these cases. And just to clarify also, that of the 190 million mentioned by the Commissioner, the vast majority is from the first year, 2020. So during the pandemic, 180 million dates back to that period. So the agency indicates that, well, rather my question is, why has the CRA not introduced these processes, these additional measures? What I can tell you is that we have been very transparent with Canadians when it comes to the risk. This is not the first time that we're talking about this. It's been years now that we've been educating Canadians. We have our website, and we are leading communication initiatives from the Government of Canada when it comes to frauds. There is a website dedicated to identity theft. It's our website, and it provides information on how people can protect themselves. So there's nothing that we're hiding. But yes, we had a delay in reporting, but we're now up to date. Well, I would need to go back, but if you type fraud, you can find that website. It should be easy to find. But in such cases, often the burden is on the shoulders of the end user. And that's what I'm trying to understand with my question. Without accusing anyone of anything, but you're saying there are resources, we have this, we have that. But if people don't know, and when we talk about digital literacy and financial literacy, maybe the level is not really high, but people still have rights. So to go back to whistleblowers, I've been interested in this topic for a while. When there's a whistleblower, it's because they were not listened to internally, or maybe they were afraid because they were dealing with a superior. So people don't do this out of nothing. People, we assume, are generally honest when they do this. So the culture at the agency seems to be more one that favors secrecy, and I think that there's more of an effort to find out who the whistleblowers were and not who the guilty were. And there is maybe a bit of an impression as to equate whistleblowers with those guilty. So according to me, there isn't a culture of secrecy at the agency. We are acutely aware of the fact that we have a lot of very sensitive information, all information of the taxpayers, and we have to make sure that this information doesn't end up in the hands of people outside the agency. So there is that aspect of things. We work on a need-to-know basis. But I think people at the agency, the vast majority of the people, respect the fact that we have to do things properly. I mean, I do understand that confidentiality is of key importance, but it's not the confidentiality that is necessary to the functioning of the agency. It is vis-a-vis the communication between the agency and citizens and individuals. So there are provincial revenue administrations that they also have the same level of secrecy. So would you say that you have a culture of secrecy or a culture of transparency? I think it's a mix of the two. There are elements of confidentiality and secrecy. It is important and necessary to protect the information.
Quickly, please.
So we report breaches and other situations when there's a scam or a fraud or a conviction. We make that information publicly available because it is a deterrent.
Sorry, Mr. When I cut you off, we were 30 seconds over there. So when I asked you to go short, I need you to go short, please, okay? Because I got to be fair to all the other members, including Mr. Green. Mr. Green, 6 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. And I did, as I suggested, we'll be taking a bit of a different tone with staff. Obviously, with ministers, it's a bit more adversarial. But I am keenly interested on the concept of whistleblowers. And so, Mr. Hamilton, who in your department is responsible for the Public Service Disclosure Protection Act?
The public, that would be the Integrity Commissioner, the act that defines that.
I understand that under the Act, every chief executive in the federal public service must designate a senior officer and establish an internal disclosure mechanism. So who would that be?
In our department, it was Natalie Mayer, I believe.
Okay, and we understand that there are categories of disclosure. You spoke earlier about loyalty, and I think for the average taxpayer, when they hear that, you know, with all the conspiracies about deep state and all these other things, that might become problematic. So I want to take an opportunity to unpack that a little bit. Under what circumstances is it legally allowed for a public sector employee to provide disclosure to the media?
Well, as public servants, we can all do that. We do have spokespersons for the agency. So
Sorry, If
Right.
there are staff within the agency who are acting as a whistleblower, being defined as a staff who goes public with information, not internally, are there ever instances, in your opinion, that staff from the CRA have the right to disclose to the media publicly in absence of the internal mechanism?
Well, I guess I would differentiate two things. One, sometimes we do speak publicly about not a problem within the agency, but we talk about what's happening, a factual type of technical briefing, so we can have those. But it tends to be controlled, if I can put it that way.
Mr. Hamilton, I want to be direct, and sometimes I don't ask questions in direct ways, maybe. We're talking about, in the context of this, Fifth Estate investigation, where staff have, medium level, I don't know which level staff, have disclosed to the media. We're now getting reports that there's an investigation. You suggested, sir, in the previous round of testimony, that can include retaliation up to termination. So I'm asking you, as the commissioner, under what circumstances would it be ethically, legally allowed under the Act to have protected disclosure?
Well, I believe that the Act says you can disclose to the Public Sector Integrity Commissioner. But I'm not a lawyer. I don't have the Act in front of me.
So I'll share with you as a labor guy and the labor critic for our party, looking at PIPSI, that disclosure can be made to the media in cases where there's not sufficient time to follow through on a regular internal process. That it can be to a media, but obviously there needs to be a serious breach of law or an imminent risk of substantial or specific danger to life, health, or safety of persons in the environment. Of course, they would want to get internal union advice on that, but the point we're trying to make here is that from time to time, when there are systems failures that are not about disclosing individual cases or disaggregated information about privacy matters of individual citizens, but rather aggregated cases of systemic failures, would you not agree that there are, under some instances, an ethical rationale for going public?
I suppose in theory, there could be something where you've exhausted all of your opportunities.
Now, I'll give you one other example
Sure.
where their disclosure would be protected, because I asked you earlier, and I'll let you close with the question that I asked you at the end, which the question was, for your memory, what do you have to say to those people who might be feeling like they're being investigated now for being whistleblowers to the media and, as you testified, could be facing termination? I want to put to you, there's another example where they could be protected, and that is in the instance of a public parliamentary hearing. So in theory, I could invite publicly to all the whistleblowers to make anonymous submissions to this committee, which in theory, based on my reading, although I'm not a lawyer, they would probably want to talk to their union, could protect them under the Act. Would you agree that that's a possibility here, given the parliamentary privileges extended by Parliament?
Yeah, I don't have a particular comment on the parliamentary privilege and what's in or out. What I would say, and what would I say to our employees, is if you think you see something that's going wrong in the agency that you want to talk about, I would point them to those avenues that we have, which the three that I've mentioned. And if you get frustrated on that, I would like somebody to come and talk to me.
And in the event they don't, what's the consequence?
In the event they don't what?
In the event that they don't go through the internal process and they go public to the media, now they're under investigation, what's the consequence?
Well, that would depend on what the action was, right? Because it could be relatively minor, it could be major, it could be disclosing taxpayer information, it could be something like talking about things that
Talking to the Fifth Estate about major privacy breaches to the tune of 31,000 different files. What would that hypothetically look like in terms of retaliation within the Whistleblower Act?
Well, but again, it's not so much related to, is it 31,000 files? It's really, what was the action that was taken by the employee? How serious was that of a violation of something? And we would have to
I'm
look
out
at
of
that.
time. I did commit to you, I'd give you the opportunity to answer. That's the 6 minutes that I have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Green. 5-minute round. Mr. Chambers, go ahead.
I know my colleague, Mr. Green, is not a lawyer, but he plays a good one on TV sometimes. I just, Mrs. Glarneau, I just want to, I'm just a little confused just about timeline. Is it that the agency was unaware of the totality of the privacy breaches when you were working through the backlog, or did you know the number and you chose not to report it?
So first of all, I want to say that there was no nefarious intent here to hide any information, nor was there an intention to delay any kind of reporting. I think that's an important
I understand.
piece
So the
of,
question is,
put forth.
were you aware, like, it's one thing to not know that there was 31,000, but another to be aware that there's 31,000 and not report? Okay, Mr. Lemieux.
So we were aware that we had thousands of those cases. It was reported in the OEG report. At that time, the report was saying that in July of 2022, we had 23,000 of them for $131 million, which information we gave to the OEG that was in the report. I came to committee in February, and I said that we were at 26,000 at that time. And we were continuing to find those cases because it takes a long time. We have to validate everything. Our intent was to report on those, but our priority was to deal with these. And it was never our intention not to disclose those. We had to find a mechanism to do it. And what I can assure you is that we reported on all of those.
My time is very limited. I understand it's not your intention, but the result was that there was a miscommunication or a lack of communication between the CRA and the Privacy Commissioner. Was that a fair assessment then?
I don't know to which extent the Commissioner was not aware when those breaches were reported by the OEG.
I'd like to move on. With respect to the fraud, the GST schemes, the carousel schemes, when did the CRA first learn that this was a serious issue? Like what year? Not a date, but what year? Are we going back a couple years? Is it just the last year? When did these schemes really become on your radar?
Yeah, I mean, the carousel schemes within the GST have been known in the GST community internationally.
Okay.
For a number of years. The severity of it, I'm not sure when it became.
Okay, I guess the question is, has the CRA made, in previous years, have you made any recommendations to the Finance Department to enact legislative changes to help prevent these schemes?
We do two
Point
things.
of order, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead on your point of order.
Thanks, Chair. I do understand that you are very lenient, but I think that the tighter we can keep it, the better it is for this specific issue, and I would question relevance on this question.
Go ahead.
GST carousel schemes are fraud. We're talking about fraud today. So the question is, has the CRA made recommendations for legislative change to help combat these schemes? Have you spoken to the Finance Department about this?
I can say that we have had discussions with our finance colleagues about this because there are things that are done in other jurisdictions, but we also take responsibility ourselves.
But we haven't. There has been no legislative fix for this, and we've known about it for multiple years.
There has not been a legislative change.
Okay.
What we have been doing is on the administrative side, trying to get in earlier to capture.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. In my final minute, just back on these write-offs, which may be a result of fraud. Some of them are a result of fraud. A significant increase in the amount of corporate write-offs, $4.9 billion in 1 year. You've previously disclosed the amounts. We've talked about that today in terms of the largest amounts. Do you think, as a matter of public interest, that Section 241, we ought to consider amending 241 to make public the names of corporations that receive very large tax write-offs that owe the Canadian public money?
So I don't have a view on that I would
Okay.
express. The Section 241 is in the law. That's a Ministry of Finance responsibility.
Right, but I mean, we're these spikes, these write-offs now are getting to serious levels. 11 corporate taxpayers wrote off over $1 billion. We don't know who those corporations are. As a matter of public interest, now that we're talking about real money, don't you think that the public should know who these corporations are?
Need a quick response, please. Quick.
Yeah, and again, I don't really have a comment on that. We do our best to be as transparent as we can with what we have. If you'd like, in a later questioning, perhaps Mark could outline a little bit more about the write-off process. But we concentrate on having a robust process to
Okay.
try to get debts
Thank
collected.
you. Ms.